and welcome. We are live here at the Birmingham Museum, sitting in our very own CREEM reading room, and this room has a lot of memories for me particularly. I mean, this is something that we as a staff have worked on for a while, but when I started here at the museum about 4 years ago, Leslie came up to me and she's like, "Hey, do you like classic rock?" I'm like, "Yeah, I enjoy it." And she's like, "Cool, we have this huge collection that was just donated of CREEM magazines, and you need a project, everyone else is already working on projects, so we're gonna have you work on this." And then a couple of years later, our collection was growing and growing and growing, so I really love this room.
I guess you can tell that Caitlin takes a lot of ownership of our CREEM collection, and for good reason, because this is a girl who read every single issue we have. And although we don't have a complete run, we have, I don't know how many, 70, 80,
yeah.
More even. So when it comes to something about CREEM, she's my go-to walking resource. And we're here today because CREEM is bigger than both of us by far. And we have, this is one of the most exciting things that has happened to the Birmingham Museum. And it all came together in a real serendipitous way, but that story is for another time. All I really should say about that is that we undertook to just talk a little bit about the music-related history of Birmingham in 2014 for our exhibit. And it turned into this whole thing about CREEM, and we learned more about CREEM because we didn't really know a lot about it at the time. We connected with former CREEM staff. We ended up with this magnificent loan of artifacts and ephemera and documents and materials that then were given to us, all by CREEM art director Charlie Oranger. So he's a big part of our story. The CREEM collection that we have is the finest, most complete collection of any CREEM memorabilia anywhere in a public institution that we know of. Sure, there are things in private collections, and no, we don't have a full run of every issue. We wish we did. But we're gathering things all the time. People still donate things to us. So what we created with that was we wanted to kind of reconstruct these stories we were hearing from former CREEM staff like Susan Whitehall, Charlie Oranger, Ben Edmonds, the people who would talk about at the time that we started the exhibit about what it was like to work at CREEM. We were reading things. We were just trying to compile what was it like in the 1970s in Birmingham, Michigan, where CREEM Magazine was being produced from 1973 to 1986. What was that like? And this is the result. We had a former member of the CREEM staff came through the exhibit after it was up, and he said, "It gives me chills," because it was so much, he felt like, the vibe anyway, of the original CREEM offices. And we had other CREEM staff say, "It's just not messy enough."
Yeah.
So at the end of this, I think we're going to do like a quick 360 so you can see what we have in this exhibit room that is now devoted to CREEM Magazine. Okay. So CREEM is just, we could talk about CREEM a long time.
Right, but just to go back at the beginning, I probably should have done this before. What is CREEM Magazine?
Good point.
CREEM Magazine was a magazine dedicated to covering rock and roll in mostly the U.S. And it got its start in 1969 in Detroit, in what is now Midtown. 1973, they moved their offices to downtown Birmingham. They were upstairs of the Birmingham Theater, and their tagline was "America's only rock and roll magazine." And they were kind of picking a fight with Rolling Stone at the time, of which they were second in terms of subscriptions and everything. Because Rolling Stone would often cover politics, they would cover environmental issues, and CREEM Magazine really didn't. They were all about the music, so.
Yeah, actually, CREEM Magazine was formed in 1969 by a couple of guys on Wayne State University's campus, Tony Ray and Barry Kramer, and they were kind of, sort of, students there. And Barry Kramer had a head shop called, I think, Mixed Media. So they just hatched this idea, hey, what if we produced, a magazine, and initially they were going to cover poetry, arts, movies, as well as music, and they did. So the first few magazines really have a lot more of that, essays about poetry, inclusion of a lot of that. Kind of the beat sort of period was still happening a little bit.
Right, so they were covering John Sinclair, his movement, his sit-ins in Ann Arbor and stuff to try to legalize marijuana. And he was recently in the news too, as he was first in line at these shops where it's being sold legally now. So everything's coming full circle.
So from that point on, the magazine just arced up. And in part, it had this kind of like a golden age. Probably something that could never really be re-experienced now. Everything came together in a particular way. They didn't have a lot of money. They had a lot of talent, though. They gathered together some of the most talented early rock critics that have ever been produced by the field. And so I believe you have something you want to say?
Oh, we got Lester Bangs here with us. When our exhibit is back open again, he makes for a great selfie station. I have a lot with him. We both bring dog ears. It's great.
Plus, when we walk into the exhibit room, we always do a double take, like someone's standing here.
Yes. So he's here. He's helping us social distance. He's all about public health, our Lester. But yeah, he was one of the most legendary rock critics in the U.S., and he worked for CREEM for a number of years.
Right.
So.
He came to CREEM from Rolling Stone because he had got kicked out, I guess you could say, in simple terms, and he gave them the finger and ended up at CREEM, and CREEM welcomed him with open arms. Oh, you want to say whatever you want to say? You want to have his first article was so long and so involved, it actually took 2 issues to publish it. But from there, Lester Bangs became really much kind of a legend. He helped his fellow editors and writers get going. He had legendary fights with Barry Kramer, which are captured in photographs even. There are plenty of stories. One of the ones I happen to like the best, because the typewriter is so important in the world of a journalist in the 1970s, and so there are stories about what would happen with typewriters when people were upset. One of them is that it went out the window when they were down in the cast quarter. They had offices there. So there's a lot we could say about it. We're not experts in CREEM by any means, but we have talked to a lot of people about CREEM. And in 2014, when we opened, we were opening our music exhibit. Before we received all this in our permanent collection, we actually held a reunion of CREEM staff here, which we video recorded. And we turned it into kind of a group oral history, which is a neat way to have people interact together instead of just, a one-on-one interview, which we do have captured on video. And if those of you that are watching this are going, well, I haven't seen that, where is that? How can I get it? Let us know. We do have it on video, and at some point, I'd love to get it captioned and get it up online, but we're still doing so much online stuff, it might take a little while. Anyway, so we have had different points at which we've sort of intersected with the CREEM story. So in 2014, I actually interviewed a number of the people and said, what would you want people to know about CREEM? What would you want to be remembered for? So I have new quotes that we took then, but there are a bunch of interesting older quotes that come right out of their publication. I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin because she's got some favorite things she wants to mention.
Well, I guess we have an anniversary coming up for CREEM. In May of 1971, Dave Marsh, in his Looney Tube article that he wrote, he is credited as being one of the first people to use the term punk rock in writing. The word punk has been in the English language since before Shakespeare. Punk rock may have been used before, but you know what? We're the world's largest publicly held collection of CREEM Magazine and memorabilia, so I'm going to say he coined it, and if you have a problem with it, you can fight me. Our doors are locked, so you won't get in now in that cult. But, and so he wrote this May 1971 article about how he went to a show up in Flint, performed by the band Question Mark and the Mysterians. And I guarantee you've heard their song 96 Tears before. When I first heard about this, I was like, that song that was always on that oldies station that my mom would listen to, like what? And then I went to YouTube and I started listening to it. Like midway through the song, I'm like, oh yeah, no, this is punk rock. This is, yeah, cool. And so he talks about, you know, they load up in Charlie's car, and he writes
Charlie Oranger,
yeah,
right?
He writes an entire paragraph like, I'm not calling Charlie's car a death trap, but it's a death trap. So they make it up to Flint. And, you know, he's like, it's impossible to miss such a landmark exposition of punk rock. And that's kind
there
of...
you have it.
And now it's a whole genre unto itself.
That's
and,
right.
You know, punks argue about, you know, who is the first punk rock band, who's the best punk, do some gatekeeping of punk rock, but...
And it was what year?
May 1971. So the anniversary of that article being printed is coming up actually this week. No, next week.
Uh-huh.
So, yeah.
And it's still really fresh. And that's one of the things about CREEM. When you read the copy and you read these articles, they feel so fresh. They feel so contemporary. We have, although we're closed to the public now because of the pandemic, we have had lots of interest in our CREEM collection by teenagers and young adults who were not even a twinkle in anyone's eye in the 1970s. But they're really drawn to the culture, the 80s, the time, and some of the irreverent attitude is very easy to love, let's put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, one of their most famous quotes is associated with CREEM, that's kind of in the mythology of the magazine and rock and roll and everything today, is rock stars aren't our friends. And so, unlike Rolling Stone, which even at that point had a reputation for never writing a negative review of a band, writing a negative
Or someone
review.
say sucking up to the record companies.
Yeah,
and
they would totally do that. And the writers at CREEM were not afraid to, I mean, they would sometimes pick artists that weren't on the mainstream radar yet, and they would really praise them. So artists like Bob Seger kind of really got their start from CREEM writers championing him, championing his music and saying, this is good, this is something you should be paying attention to, and kind of glossing over some of those other more overrated bands.
Interestingly, CREEM had, when they were located in Detroit especially, they would have people just like crash on their couch. MC5 practiced down the hall. Iggy Pop was had kind of this love-hate relationship with Lester Bangs, and would hang out there a lot. But you're right, they would cover, you know, emerging talent. For example, one of the early ones was David Bowie. Mm-hmm. When he first came to the U.S., he came to Detroit. They raved about him in CREEM afterward. And you know, you read that and you go, wow, they really picked a winner there. Mm-hmm. But that was part of what they were about. They loved the music, and it was a time when the differences between the physical distances and barriers between musicians, performing musicians, and journalists covering them were very fluid. So there are some famous stories about Jan Juhalski, who was, you know, a progressive, kind of barrier-breaking woman editor at CREEM, who also used to cover a lot of the bands, and by cover I mean as a journalist. But she would, she'd get to know these guys and hang out with them, and sometimes go up on stage with them. And very famously was given her own version of a Kiss makeup and joined them on stage. And there was a photograph of her doing that. And she was like the only one who could have done that. And the way she puts it, and I can't quote it because I don't have it in front of me, but in general she said, "It's because I was a girl." You
right.
know,
I was an underrepresented, undergendered.
Undergendered,
I could get away with it, yeah.
And now Jan Juhalski has gone on to write for Rolling Stone. She's very well-recognized rock critic who does lots of writing still and is still around. Another famous woman, writer, editor was Susan Whiteall, who is still around also. Susan was with CREEM for a number of years. She worked with Jan. Jan left, Susan continued, and Susan went on from CREEM to work for, she was music critic for the Detroit News for many, many years, and she writes now. She's written a couple of books. She just wrote one on Joni Mitchell, in fact. So, and Susan is from Birmingham, so you know, we have a lot of reasons to thank Susan for all her contributions. She's helped us a tremendous amount, giving us background, sharing, you know, photos, stories, and helping us out when we wanted to connect with other people. So let's see, what else can we talk about CREEM in this short time that we have today that would kind of capture some of...
Yeah, well, I mean, I have a favorite article. I mean, I've read just about everything. And actually, if anyone has the insert for the issue where it has the Abbey Road cover on the front, we have the cover, we don't have the inside. And so
Which is that one over there?
Yes,
Okay.
which now
I should grab
we
that.
actually contributed to a project where they digitized every single issue of CREEM Magazine. So now we have it, a database online that people can visit when they come to the museum and read it. And I was so excited to read it because this is one of my favorite music conspiracy theories, is the whole Paul is dead thing. And it actually started in Michigan, so rest of the world, you are welcome for the Paul is dead conspiracy theory. So they covered that, which, I mean, you know, is kind of, it's become very legendary. And another way where CREEM is kind of interacting with the mythology of rock and roll is when it comes to Leonard Skinner and the death of Ronnie Van Zant, especially. So a couple months in early 1977, Jenny Helsky actually went and hung out with Leonard Skinner and was interviewing Ronnie specifically. And as part of the interview, he mentions that he doesn't see himself working past the age of 30. And very famously, a couple months after that, he dies. And then he also has this really great quote, and this is one of my favorite quotes of all time, is, you know, he had a tomato juice in front of him, and Jan goes up and she's like, oh, hey, you know, Bloody Mary, you drinking? And he's like, no, I only drink when I'm on the job. And I think a lot of us wish we could say same. Maybe you guys working at home, y'all are a little juiced. When you're going in your Zoom meetings, don't worry, we will not narc you out to your boss. But, and I mean, that's kind of one of my favorite articles that I've read in CREEM, is just because that does intersect so much with the mythology of, like, Ronnie Van Zant knew he was going to die. He knew he was doomed in all this. And, yeah.
Well, and CREEM had a lot of different ways that they contributed to the general culture. One of the things, in my mind, is the way they use their covers, especially early on. So I have a little, like a diagram. We have this in our exhibit, so I'm gonna hold it up. Hope you can see this. So what we have here is the evolution from the first CREEM cover, which this is a mounted facsimile of. Doesn't that look like a headshot kind of thing from 1969?
And it's very like zine from the 80s and 90s too, where like, again, like these punks were just taking the media and working with it, and you know, and not a very polished aesthetic.
There were two drawings for the first and second issue, which was, first issue was March of 1969, so I think March, April, I believe. Drawn by the same person, but they weren't even credited. It was, you know, that kind of a production at the time. So that's this first version. By November of the same year, you have this coming out. So the CREEM brand or label, logo, has already started getting some polish. And then by June of 1971, they had this cover, which has the CREEM, kind of an early bubble letter version. Bubble letters were a cool thing back then. I remember drawing them when I was in 7th grade on everything. And then finally this, much more recognizable CREEM. Again, it's a form of a bubble letter, but it is what you see on all of the from September 1971 through the late 1980s. Other ideas, other stories?
So I think one of the important, when we opened this exhibit, when we started working with the collection, we did get a little bit of what I'm going to call like a pushback. And part of that was just because people who had lived in Birmingham during this time when CREEM moved in, and they hated it then, they hated these long-haired hippies playing music really loud, and they don't like it now. But also we had a lot of people who were like kind of a little taken aback at our collection because it's always a little weird when something from your lifetime that you remember, that you lived through, ends up in a museum's collection, and it goes on display. And so I think that's kind of where a lot of history is going now. It used to be, we're collecting things from 200, 150, 100 years ago, but everything becomes history eventually. Like, we're all living in history. So, even though it does feel a little weird if a museum is displaying something from your lifetime. I mean, I was alive for the end of CREEM's run. So yeah, it's like this is part of what the field is, and this is why it's important to start collecting these things, because we do have these people who worked for the magazine, who wrote for it, who read it when it first came out, who loved it. And not just the objects, but getting those voices recorded and making sure that those stories are still around is just so important.
As a museum, we've shifted our focus in the last 10 years from collecting objects, which is kind of traditional, we talked about that last time a little, to telling our story. So we're telling Birmingham's story, and whether you read CREEM or you were offended by CREEM at the time it was being published out of Birmingham, it is part of Birmingham's story. So we happen to like sharing that story. We get a lot of enjoyment out of it. Like I said, the content is still very fresh and very contemporary. And one of the things I think that helps me is to remember that we all are going to take away whatever it means to us. There is no truth, so we don't have to worry about presenting truth. All we have to do is present objects, present quotes, make the information available to people, and they'll draw their own conclusions. We've had a number of people come and research particular questions that they're using CREEM as a source, so that's been pretty fun and interesting. So it's still alive today in all these important ways. I did capture a couple of images and some quotes that I think might be fun. So I want to share that, and I know Caitlin has a couple of objects she might want to show. You want to do the objects first?
Sure. Yeah. So in the case behind us, we do have a lot of our memorabilia, things that they were using for more promotional items and everything. So one of these is, you'll still today see people walking around with this shirt on because the Boy Howdy movie recently came out, and as part of their Kickstarter campaign, they released shirts with this insignia on it.
But this is one of the originals.
Yes, straight from the 70s.
Right, they would, toss these out, make them available at outdoor rock concerts, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and here we have some Boy Howdy beer. There was never a thing, Boy Howdy beer was never a real thing. They would take bottles like we have today, I think this is a Diet Coke bottle, and cover it with their little mascot. And then they would have these shots of rock musicians, rock bands, all drinking
Boy, howdy dear.
So we have a couple of these in there, and so yeah, just some really great stuff. We also have the cameras that Charlotte Oringer used to shoot a lot of these super iconic covers, which is just, I mean, fantastic. As a photographer myself, you know, your camera kind of becomes an extension of you, and so it becomes something very, very personal. And so to kind of have that in our collection is, I think, just so special.
Okay, and let me do my show and tell too. Okay, first of all, during our 2014 exhibit, even though the famous quote is, "Rock stars are not our friends," we actually had a rock star here who, at least for a while, definitely was our friend, and I think, you know, could be again. This is Chad Smith of Red Hot Chili Peppers. Chad came in for an event that we invited him to during the time we also had our CREEM display. The first thing he did was grab a chair, sit down, hold the desk phone that was on display up to his ear as though he was at CREEM answering the phone. So we snapped this shot of him doing that. So that's Chad, not 2014. What else do we have? Well, these are really some quotes that I thought I would read. I mentioned that I interviewed and captured the messages, let's say, from some of the CREEM staff in 2014 when we were putting this together. So I'm going to show this, but then I'm going to have to turn it around to read it. This is a photo of Jan Uhelski on stage, well, backstage, I guess, with Kiss when she had her own version of a Kiss makeup, and she's the short one in the middle, easy to pinpoint. So when I asked her about what it was like to work for CREEM or anything she wanted to communicate about it, she said, quote, "We thought the rock stars were exactly the same as we were. It was an egalitarian era. Back then, there was no separation between artists and journalists. Those were the golden years of music journalism," unquote. And you actually see that life portrayed in the Philip Seymour Hoffman starring movie, Almost Famous. He actually is not the main character. He plays Lester Bangs in the movie by Cameron Crowe about a young, I don't know, like, isn't he like 19-year-old or something, music journalist wannabe who goes on tour with this fictitious band in the same style as all these journalists were doing back then. And in the film, he periodically calls and sometimes meets with Lester Bangs to get insight and inspiration. And so Lester has a few, or Cameron Crowe's version of Lester has a few key things that he communicates. Now, Lester actually did say to Jan Uhelski when they worked together here at CREEM, in fact, they were hired the same day. He did say, and they reminded each other, rock stars are not our friends. And another version of that was, we're not cool. We're not cool, as in we're never going to be cool. They're cool, and we don't maybe want to be cool. So you see some of that in the movie. The movie came out in 2007. Again, it's called Almost Famous. It's a great movie if you haven't seen it. The CREEM staff told us that when Philip Seymour Hoffman was studying for the part of Lester Bangs, he contacted a number of them, and he listened to recordings of Lester's voice, and he really, according to Susan Whitehall, he really nailed it. So if you want to know a little bit more about what Lester was like, you might want to catch that. Another writer was Robert Duncan. So this photo, which I know is very small, but I'm going to show it anyway, was taken in CREEM's office, and this is where our cutout of Lester comes from. This photo, which was taken upstairs of the Birmingham Theater, where CREEM's offices were, like Caitlin said, from 73 to 86. And in the background are two guys who are leaning back. One of them is Robert Duncan, who's also a writer-editor. So what he said to me was, quote, "Basically, I was a terminal comedic exhibitionist, driven to get everyone around me to laugh at anything and everything, including most especially me. When which is apparently a pretty good way to run a so-called creative business. Lester once said, I was the only person he'd met who was as funny as him, which gives you some insight into Lester. He laughed at my jokes and pushed me to become a better writer. At the same time, I laughed at his and in a different way pushed him as a writer. Now, another key figure who is actually a huge part of our collection, even though he's sort of the quiet man in the back, is Charlie Oranger. Charlie was the art director. He was the photographer early on, and then he became the art director, doing all the layouts, working with all the freelance photographers, and was really a part of the organization all the way through until 1986. He is a man of few words, let me put it that way. But what he did say is, quote, I kind of regret that when I was with the bands shooting photos that I couldn't just sit back and enjoy the concert. I always was looking through the lens, always working. Okay, so I think because our time is running down now, we better wind things up. Caitlin, anything you want to?
Yeah, so I guess, you know what, like, let us know if you're watching this afterwards or later on, like, tell us your memories of CREEM. Like, did you read it? Did you only recently rediscover it? We want to know kind of what your connection is to this story. And we would love to hear it, even if it's, you know, you've only recently discovered CREEM and, you know, this is your favorite article ever or anything like that. Like, we want to know everything. Museum people, we're very nosy. We just want to know everything about everyone, so.
And we just love to be trendsetters. So I have to show you this. This is a copy of the poster for Boy Howdy, The Story of CREEM Magazine, which is a documentary that was produced last year, and it was going to come out into general distribution this year, theater distribution, except pandemic happened, so I don't know what its status is, but one of the producers is J.J. Kramer, who was Barry Kramer, who founded CREEM, his son. And the reason I show the photo is because in a moment, when you get a pan of this exhibit, you may see something that looks a little familiar, because I think when we created our immersion experience, it gave them a couple ideas about how they might want to represent CREEM's offices. Although we don't have any cigarette smoking in here.
No, we cannot. We are part of the city of Birmingham, so we got to keep things.
Right.
We got to keep things public health.
So read CREEM and enjoy.
Yeah, we'll see you next week where we're going to do stories about mothers in Birmingham for Mother's Day. So talking about mothers from the 1820s all the way through to the 20th, 21st century.
Yeah,
so
every single one of them is going to get covered.
It's going to be a long one. But yeah, thank you so much for tuning in and have a wonderful rest of the week. We'll see you next week. Bye. All right, now I'm going to do a little... we're going to do a little spin around. I'm going to show you parts of the exhibit. So here are Charlie's cameras that I was talking about earlier. So we've got two of them, just super fantastic. We have our in memoriam wall. So artists and writers who have left us. So we have that. Nope. This is where Lester normally hangs out. We got some stuff about Lester here. So some of our memorabilia and all of that. So super cool stuff, including we actually got a magazine, and a CREEM magazine that actually had their annual poll as to, you know, who is the best and who is the worst of the year. Usually the writers of CREEM would stuff the ballot box, as they would tell us. So to find one of these from like an actual person is really, really cool. And then we got some covers over here, some more of the iconic covers. And then this is kind of our recreation of the desk. So we got the typewriter there. It works. You can type on CREEM letterhead. It's super awesome. So yeah, and that is our room. So we hope to see you soon when we reopen, and hope to see you in the CREEM reading room.